Hey, it's our last week for school this year. I'm going to do a really quick wrap-up video for Vietnam, and then that'll be it. We're completely done. My face is glowing. I have weird lighting in here, but I'm not going anywhere else. It's too loud. So we're out to 1972. Richard Nixon is up for re-election, and he's going to, of course, run again. And shortly before he has to run, of course, we have to pick the Democrats who are going to run against him. And so we have two guys that are running. A guy by the name of George McGovern, who is very, very opposed to the war in Vietnam, wants it to end, and a guy by the name of George Wallace, who we've talked about before. If you remember watching the civil rights video, the governor of Alabama who said segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, this is George Wallace, and he's running for president of the United States. Now, in between when he said that and now, he claims to have become a born-again Christian. He's renouncing his segregationist views from the past, and he's in Maryland campaigning to get the Democratic nomination for president, and he's shot in the back by a guy by the name of Arthur Bremer. Now, Arthur Bremer didn't hate George Wallace. Arthur Bremer actually wanted to kill Richard Nixon, but he discovered that there was no possible way he could get at the President of the United States. All he wanted was to become famous, so he was crazy. Shoots McGovern, paralyzes him, does not kill him. And up until just a few years ago, Arthur Bremer was actually being held in prison in Hagerstown, Maryland. I believe he has gotten out, but I'm not 100% positive now. But shoots Wallace, and McGovern gets the nomination. Nixon runs against McGovern then, and shortly before the election, Nixon announces to the American people, peace is at hand. We've almost done it. The war is almost over. And he wins by a landslide. Now, over in Vietnam, or in Paris, I guess, his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, is negotiating with the North Vietnamese, but they've left a key group of people out. The South Vietnamese have no representatives there negotiating. I'm going to shut these blinds and see if I can get a little bit better. Maybe my face won't glow quite as much. That's a little better. The North Vietnamese don't agree to the deal because they have no say in it, and the deal falls through. The war fires back up, and over Christmas of I guess that would be 72, Nixon begins bombing North Vietnam heavily for 2 weeks. They called them the Christmas bombings. Finally, we're going to keep kind of jumping ahead. 1973 comes, they've reached a new deal. And in 1973, at the end of June of 1973, a ceasefire is signed. And as part of the ceasefire deal, there is a prisoner exchange between the North and South. The United States agrees to withdraw troops and to try to help rebuild South Vietnam. We start pulling all of our troops out. And in 1975, when the majority of the American troops are out, North Vietnam re-invades the South, which they always said they were going to do secretly, and takes it over. Now, there are Americans in South Vietnam. In the embassy, the North Vietnamese overrun the U.S. Embassy, and there are these famous images and videos, and I think I have some linked in the PowerPoint, of Americans being evacuated off the roof of the embassy by helicopter and taken out to ships in the Pacific. And everybody's looking to see what will America do. Will they come back in and try to secure South Vietnam, or will they let the war kind of get out of here? Stupid cat. Or will they, he messed up my pages here, or will they sit on the sidelines and watch it happen? And we allow it to just go on. We don't come back in. South Vietnam falls to communism. And Vietnam becomes united as one country, no more North and South. Now, there are thousands and thousands of people in South Vietnam that were loyal to the Americans, and when the North takes over, when the communists come back in, those people are terrified to stay. They're afraid they're going to be tortured or killed. And so if you ever get a chance to look up the Vietnamese boat people, they get in these boats and go out into the Pacific Ocean to try to get out of Vietnam and get somewhere new. Some of them make it, some of them don't. Some are able to come to the United States and live. Children are flown out of Vietnam who were orphaned during the war and brought to the U.S. to carry on new lives. But in the end, the whole reason we fought the Vietnam War, this idea of a domino theory, where if South Vietnam becomes communist, the rest of Southeast Asia will too, the domino theory proves false. So the question is always asked, did we fight that war for no reason at all? We lost over 58,000 Americans. A number of guys from our school were killed in Vietnam. The one I know the best is a guy by the name of Claire Ritchie, because he was my dad's friend. Grew up just down the road from me here, kind of near, I think I put it in one of your questions, kind of near Olivia Clark's house, just on the other side of the road, right along 26. And he was killed in South Vietnam in 1968 when they called it a fire base. It was like a base, came under attack, and he was killed by a bazooka type weapon, a shoulder fired rocket. And I have some pictures of the different letters his family got from Richard Nixon, as well as some of the medals and stuff like that. And it would have been his niece, girl I had in class years ago, making a rubbing of his name on the wall in Vietnam, in D.C. Okay, so the war ends. A couple things that happened. The 26th Amendment was passed because remember that at this time period you could be drafted at the age of 18, but you still had to be 21 to vote, and people didn't think that was right. So the 26th Amendment was passed, which lowered the voting age to 18 in 1972. Lasting effects of the war, of course, you have vast swaths of territory in North and South Vietnam destroyed by bombing and war. Agent Orange provide lasting health effects for both American and Vietnamese people. We talked about the birth defects that came with the children that they had later in life. Increased rates of cancer and neurological disorders, heart problems. If you know older Vietnam veterans that were in country during the war, there's a decent chance that a lot of them had Agent Orange exposure and may have some lasting side effects of that. Of course, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, a lot of soldiers come home with that, don't know how to deal with it. Hopefully you watched that Medal of Honor video on Gary Bykirk, and he's a really good example. The guy came home and he went up and lived in a cave by himself for months after the war because he didn't know how to deal with the general public. And didn't know how to deal with all these things he had going on in his head. So returned home with a lot of problems, and of course, as a side effect, increased drug use and alcohol abuse from those veterans who didn't know how to cope with the issues they were dealing with, of course. There's a good book about that. If you ever get a chance to read it, it's called The Things They Carried, and it talks about kind of some of these issues these guys came home with. Of course, the Pentagon Papers cause Americans to really distrust information coming out of their government, proved how much they lied, and of course 58,000 plus American soldiers that were killed. Now, when the war was over, we wanted a way to kind of commemorate those soldiers, and probably one of the darkest and saddest things about the Vietnam War is when those guys came home, they were not treated like the war heroes that they were. These are guys who didn't necessarily agree with the war, but were doing what their country asked them to do. And when they came home, sometimes they were spit on. They had coffee thrown on them. They were called baby killers. They were just treated horribly. And this is one of the lessons we learned from Vietnam. In hindsight, looking back on it, I think pretty much everybody realizes that was a horrible thing to do. And so even today, in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, when you hear people debate whether or not we should be there and all this, they will debate that issue, but they always say we should support our troops. And that's kind of one of those lasting impacts of Vietnam where people look back and say, man, we shouldn't have done that. All right, wrapping this up quickly. The Vietnam Wall was built to commemorate those 58,000 soldiers. If you ever get a chance to go to D.C., I would not go now. But sometime in the future and you get a chance to go to the wall, you'll notice it's black and it's reflective, and the idea is that when you look at the names on the wall, you see your reflection and remember that those guys died for you. Now, DC is a pretty good hike. We have one closer, much smaller, in Altoona. If you just go past the mall, keep driving, and on your right-hand side of the road by the VA hospital, you'll see some American flags. Pull in there, and there is a smaller Vietnam Wall built to scale. And you can find different names on it. They usually have like little phone books there or something that you can look the names up. They're not in alphabetical order. They're in the order that they were killed in the war. So you'll have to look the names up. But that's it. That's Vietnam. My goal would have been to get a little bit farther in this unit, or not this unit, but this year. I usually wrap the year up by talking about Watergate and try to get into the late 70s, early 80s, but don't always make it. So you'll notice on our Canvas page for this week, I do have a National Geographic video. It's about 50 minutes long about Watergate to kind of give you a background of what that was. And if you get a little extra time this week, I would take a chance and watch that. It is the only time in American history that a president resigned the office, and so I think it's important to understand why. Probably won't see you guys again. Might get a little bit of communication from me, but your last grade is the section review that goes with this. That's our only grade for the week, and we're pretty much done. So have a great summer, stay safe, and hopefully see you next year. Bye.